weapons and fuel to the military. Our resolution also calls for the full implementation of ASEAN's 5-point consensus and the scaling up of humanitarian assistance. The majority of the Council wants to do this, and ASEAN themselves have called for strengthened cooperation with the UN. But a small minority has prevented the Council from acting sooner. But the suffering of the Myanmar people requires Council action now. So we'll continue to press those outstanding Council members to join us. For the UK's part, we've led international efforts to cut off the junta's access to weapons and jet fuel, imposing sanctions on 25 individuals and 33 businesses involved in the trade. Since 2021, the UK has provided almost $200 million of humanitarian aid and life-saving assistance to the people of Myanmar. The UK continues to stand with the people of Myanmar. Thank you.
Good morning. We, the people of Myanmar, are very frustrated. Lack of effective action from the UN, especially the UN Security Council, continues. Lack of serious attention from the international community carries on. Lack of coherence within the UN systems persists. All these are happening at the expense of lives of innocent civilians and at the expense of future of the people of Myanmar, especially our young generations. The military junta does not stop committing international crimes. Indiscriminate area bombings on the civilian populations, torching villages, mass killing of civilians, arbitrary arrests and detention, torture and violence in forms of sexual and gender-based forced conscription, and all atrocities committed and transnational organized crimes fueled by the military junta in the complete absence of rule of law have been resulting in the immense suffering of Myanmar people at an unprecedented level. The junta can commit these heinous crimes clearly with direct or indirect support of some corners of the international community. Therefore, we urge the UN member states and the international community to stop flows of arms and weapons, dual-use items, jet fuel, and financial supplies to the military junta immediately. Another point I wish to make here regarding the junta's planned Shan election. Clearly, military junta does not have legitimacy or moral authority to conduct any elections. Any elections organized by the junta will never be free, fair, or inclusive. The people already expressed their will through the 2020 free and fair general elections. The military ignored it by staging the illegal coup in 2021. The people of Myanmar strongly reject the junta's sham elections. I urge the international community to steadfastly oppose such planned sham elections of the junta. In the name of humanity, I urge the member states, especially the member states of the UN Security Council, to bring some hopes to our people through today's private meeting on Myanmar. I thank Ambassador Barbara Woodward, Permanent Representative of UK and her team for their hard work, and I thank you.
Ambassador, it's Margaret Bashir with Voice of America. The junta doesn't seem to be bowing to any international pressure so far. It's been a couple of years now. So do you think that there can be any difference really made here in the Security Council or even in the General Assembly?
Thank you. Definitely, if there is a unified positions of this UN Security Council, if there is a unified voices from the UN Security Council, definitely it can make changes with regard to the atrocities committed by the military junta.
And do you have any update on Aung San Suu Kyi, how she is, her condition?
Personally, I haven't heard anything about Aung San Suu Kyi, because we all are very concerned with her health and her security. Thank you.
Ambassador, I'm from NHK Japan. Do you think is there any possibility of the dialogue or negotiation between the military junta and the democratic force?
Yeah, our position is very clear. We never reject the dialogue, but we need to make sure that we will not repeat that what we already have in 2010, 2015. That is what we really want to see it. So they have to apply to make sure that military will not be in politics in the future of Myanmar. Thank you.
Good morning, colleagues. The 9,790th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Israel to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in this meeting, in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. Members of the Council have before them document S/2024/835, the text of a draft resolution submitted by Algeria, Ecuador, Guyana, Japan, Malta, Mozambique, Republic of Korea, Sierra Leone, Slovenia and Switzerland. The Council is ready to proceed to the vote on the draft resolution before it, and I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements before the vote. I give the floor to Guyana.
Thank you, Madam President, for so swiftly facilitating the request to convene this meeting. I have the honor to introduce this draft resolution on behalf of the 10 elected member states of the Security Council, namely Algeria, Ecuador, Japan, Malta, Mozambique, Republic of Korea, Sierra Leone, Slovenia, Switzerland, and my own country, Guyana. The resolution before the Council is the product of several weeks of consultations among all Council members. It was prompted by the Council's deep concern over the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza, including what was unfolding in North Gaza, and the need for an urgent response to that situation. I take this opportunity to thank all delegations for their very constructive stance throughout the negotiations. Your flexibility has allowed us to develop a text which we feel responds to many critical elements of the conflict. Madam President, the text before us recalls the Security Council's primary responsibility to uphold international peace and security and demands an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire to be respected by all parties, and reiterates the Council's demand for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. This is one of the most important provisions of the text, since it addresses some of the most fundamental concerns regarding the ongoing hostilities. The text also demands that the parties comply with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. Emphasis is also placed on the last 4 resolutions adopted by the Council in relation to this conflict, reaffirming the provisions of those resolutions and demanding in particular the full and unconditional implementation of Resolution 2735 adopted in June. Critically, the draft also demands immediate access by the civilian population in the Gaza Strip to basic services and humanitarian assistance indispensable to its survival, while rejecting any effort to starve Palestinians. It also demands the facilitation of full, rapid, safe, and unhindered entry of humanitarian assistance at scale to and throughout the Gaza Strip, and the delivery of that assistance to all Palestinian civilians who need it, including to civilians in besieged North Gaza. The draft resolution acknowledges UNRWA as the backbone of the humanitarian response in Gaza and calls on all parties to enable the agency to carry out its mandate in all areas of operation. Madam President, the text represents a broad consensus achieved on the basis of careful, inclusive, and transparent negotiations. While several divergent positions have found a balance in the text, the dominant concern has been to provide a legally binding obligation to end the hostilities in Gaza. The E10 sincerely hopes that all delegations will support the text, since it aligns with our Charter responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. I thank you.
The representative of Guyana for their statement. I shall put the draft resolution to the vote now. Will those in favour of the draft resolution contained in document S/2024-835 please raise their hand? Those against? The result of the voting is as follows: 14 votes in favour, 1 vote against, 0 abstentions. The draft resolution has not been adopted owing to the negative vote of a permanent member of the Council. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements after the vote. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. Colleagues, the United States deeply regrets this Council finds itself here again. The United States worked for weeks in good faith to avoid this outcome. We made clear throughout negotiations we could not support an unconditional ceasefire that failed to release the hostages. Because, as this Council has previously called for, a durable end to the war must come with the release of the hostages. These two urgent goals are inextricably linked. This resolution abandoned that necessity, and for that reason, the United States could not support it. Simply put, this resolution would have sent a dangerous message to Hamas. There's no need to come back to the negotiating table. Hamas would have seen it as a vindication of its cynical strategy to hope and pray the international community forgets about the fate of more than 100 hostages from more than 20 member states who have been held for 410 days. We must not let that happen, ever. Let me say this clearly. There are still 7 American citizens in the hands of Hamas. We will not forget them. For our part, we will continue to pursue a diplomatic solution that brings peace, security, and freedom to Palestinians in Gaza. The United States, along with partners in the region, has worked tirelessly to achieve such a deal. But we are not there yet. Why? Because Hamas has rejected deal after deal after deal. And yet, some members of this Council, in their public statements, ignore the callous intransigence of Hamas and indeed refuse to condemn Hamas, which I'll note this resolution failed to do, again. Some members of this Council don't seem to want to confront the reality that today, it is not Israel standing in the way of a ceasefire and hostage deal. It is Hamas. Israel has said it is prepared to have a temporary ceasefire in exchange for the release of a few hostages, and then build on that to bring each and every hostage home. Colleagues, the messages we send to the world through these resolutions, they matter. And this resolution had several other problems. Among the most glaring, I've already mentioned the failure to condemn Hamas for its October 7 terrorist attack. It's inexplicable that more than 13 months since that day, some members of this Council are missing the plot, that they refuse to acknowledge it is Hamas that instigated this conflict. It is Hamas that has put millions of Palestinian civilians in harm's way and has brought the region to the precipice of a broader war. Colleagues, we've been clear that it is time for this war to end, for the hostages to be released, and for Palestinian civilians to begin rebuilding their lives. More immediately, the United States has been explicitly clear to Israel that it has a responsibility to facilitate humanitarian access and the delivery of aid at scale. We believe the process of laying out the terms of what we expect from Israel in a very detailed way has generated a change in Israel's approach. American diplomacy will continue to press for more aid in and throughout Gaza, which requires a sustained, expanded implementation of urgent steps to improve conditions on the ground. We regret that the Council could have incorporated compromise language the UK put forward to bridge the existing gaps and support these humanitarian steps. With that language, this resolution should have been adopted, and the Council would have reinforced ongoing diplomatic efforts on the ground. Indeed, we also put forward many formulations over the past few weeks that could have bridged the gaps and seen this Council speak with one voice. Despite these proposals from the United States throughout this process, many on this Council did not engage seriously on their merits and rather continued to seek a path of discord. In fact, we heard that some desired a U.S. veto rather than of a consensus product. That is cynical and unfortunate. Colleagues, this is not how this process should work. Despite the failure of the Council to reach consensus, and again, I think there was a path available to do so, the United States will keep working to improve the humanitarian situation on the ground, which, as we've said before, requires unhindered access and sustained humanitarian aid flowing into Gaza and reaching all those in need. Colleagues, in closing, let me just note that the United States has taken a very clear position since this war began, which is that Israel had a right to defend itself after the worst slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust. The United States also, over the course of the past year, has done more than any other country to take tangible steps to improve the humanitarian conditions in Gaza, even as the situation remains dire. We have also done more than anyone to work with the government of Israel in an effort to minimize civilian harm over the course of the conflict, and we continue to emphasize to Israel that more must be done to save lives. The United States also continued to work with regional partners to support a revitalized Palestinian Authority that can assume responsibility for governing Gaza and the West Bank. We've encouraged regional integration efforts that would strengthen regional stability and marginalize sources of instability. And we've never wavered in our support for a two-state solution. It's vital that we end this war in a way that charts a path forward in the post-conflict period that provides governance, security, and reconstruction in Gaza and restores dignity for civilians caught in the middle of a war they did not want. We must work toward a future where Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side within two democratic states and enjoy equal measures of security, dignity, and freedom, where Israel is secure within its own borders. Colleagues, an unconditional ceasefire with Hamas means this Council accepts Hamas retaining power in Gaza. The United States will never accept this. Rather than adopting a resolution that emboldens Hamas, let's instead demand Hamas implement Resolution 2735 without further condition or delay. Let's continue to ensure Israel facilitates additional humanitarian aid into Gaza. And let's work to bring a durable end to the suffering and misery of Hamas's many victims since October 7. This resolution sent the wrong message to the parties, but our actions and diplomacy on the ground will continue to push them in a more positive direction. We invite others on this Council to join us. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. The draft text we had in front of us today is the result of a common conviction by the 10 elected members, the E10, that this Council can no longer stand idle in the face of such uncontrolled violence, disregard for international law, including IHL, and a man-made humanitarian catastrophe. We sincerely thank Guyana for diligently coordinating the initiative. Let us be clear. The text we had in front of us today was by no means a maximalist one. It represented the bare minimum of what is needed to begin to address the desperate situation on the ground. It was a genuine effort to bring the Council to speak with one voice on a conflict that risks dragging the entire region over the precipice. It is deeply regretted that, due to the use of the veto, this Council has once again failed to uphold its responsibility to maintain international peace and security. President, as the region continues to descend into further violence, civilians across all sides continue to endure unimaginable suffering. In North Gaza, hungry Palestinian mothers trudge through a destroyed landscape, seeking food and medicine for their malnourished children, while airstrikes and hostilities continue to decimate their land and people. Innocent civilians have been held hostage in squalor by Hamas and other armed groups for over a year. Lebanese and Israeli families along both sides of the Blue Line and beyond have been forcibly displaced and their homes and communities from their homes and communities in an effort to seek safety. These are the consequences of the ongoing failure to secure a peaceful solution to this conflict. The draft resolution would have finally made a clear demand for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza. It would have demanded that the humanitarian needs of Palestinians in Gaza are urgently met, including for civilians in besieged North Gaza. It would have demanded the immediate and unconditional release of hostages. It would also have sought to call on all parties to enable UNRWA to carry out its mandate as adopted by the General Assembly in the face of grave threats emanating from the recently adopted legislation in Israel. Faced with this Council's failure to adopt a resolution which clearly speaks to these demands, Malta stresses that the parties to the conflict are fully obligated to comply and immediately and effectively implement the relevant existing Council resolutions and the orders of the ICJ. We unequivocally stress that international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law, must be respected by all parties. Despite our disappointment due to the result of today's vote, we must not give up. On the contrary, we must redouble our efforts to keep pushing for an immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza. The time has come to bring an end to this extraordinary suffering, to restore hope, to give peace a chance. A peace based on a two-state solution in accordance with Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Madam President, at the outset, I extend my gratitude to those who voted in favor of the draft resolution presented by the 10 elected members who are the representative of the collective will of the international community. It is a sad day for the Security Council, for the United Nations, and for the international community as a whole. The draft resolution this Council failed to adopt today sought only to break its deafening silence 5 months after the adoption of the Resolution 2735. 5 months during which the Security Council remained idle, remained hand-tied. This text was far from ideal, but it represented the bare minimum that should have united us. Algeria, my country, has consistently called for enforcing Security Council decisions and imposing sanctions on those who defy the collective will of the international community. For this reason, our position was to adopt a resolution under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. There were significant concessions during negotiations. Yet, one member chose to block any action from this Council. Today's message is clear. To the Israeli occupying power first. You may continue your genocide. You may continue your collective punishment of the Palestinian people with complete impunity. In this chamber, you enjoy immunity. To the Palestinian people, another clear message. While the overwhelming majority of the world stands in solidarity with your plight, tragically, others remain indifferent to your suffering. Madam President, we must ask ourselves today, as human beings, is it not enough that 44,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, 70% of whom are women and children? How many more must perish before this Council imposes a ceasefire? Is it not enough that the number of orphans in Gaza now range between 17,000 and 18,000, many of whom have no surviving family members to care for them? Gaza, once known as a city of children, has tragically become a city of orphans. How many more children must be orphaned before this Council takes actions? Is it not enough that over 170 journalists have been killed in Gaza? And how many more journalists must die before this Council acts? Colleagues, Israel, the occupying power, has killed more journalists in 1 year than those lost in World War II and the Vietnam War combined. Where are those? Where are those who proclaim to be defenders of human rights and freedom of expression? Why are they silent in the face of such atrocities? Is it not enough that at least 326 aid workers have been killed? The highest number ever recorded in history. How many more must sacrifice their lives before this Council decides sanctions? Is it not enough that over 1,000 health workers have been killed? How many more must fall before this Council takes decisive action? Is it not enough that almost the entire population of Gaza has been forcibly displaced and face famine now, with some already succumbing to hunger? How many more must starve to death before this Council responds? Madam President, in the past year, the Council adopted 4 resolutions. Negotiations were conducted. Calls from every corner of the globe were made. Yet, nothing has stopped the Israeli killing machine in Gaza. And the reason is painfully clear. Israeli leaders operate with the full knowledge that they enjoy impunity. They enjoy immunity. They are certain that this body, the Security Council, tasked with maintaining international peace and security by the UN Charter, will be prevented on acting to halt the genocide. Today, we have missed an opportunity. This failure that will have devastating consequences for the international order. But rest assured, this will not be the last time the Security Council will be forced to address a resolution on Palestine. As we have said before, and as we have delivered, we will soon return to the Security Council to demand an immediate and unconditional and permanent ceasefire in Gaza. And this time, with even a firmer language under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. And our efforts will not cease until the Council make a decisive action. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, China is very disappointed with the result of today's vote. Guyana, Algeria, and other E10 members of the Council demonstrated maximum amount of sincerity and constructiveness during the consultation of the draft resolution. The U.S. long use of the veto has dashed the hope of the people of Gaza for survival, pushing them further into darkness and desperation. I said during the Council's debate on Monday that every moment will be recorded in history and will be judged by history. We cannot imagine how the vote today, as well as the Security Council's failure to respond to the Gaza's conflict over the past 13 months, can escape the harsh judgment of history. In the future, when looking back, people will find it hard to believe what happened. When the US cast its first veto on 18 October last year, nearly 3,000 civilians had been killed in Gaza. By the time the US cast its second veto, 17,000 people had been killed as a result of Israeli bombardment. With each veto, the death toll in Gaza continued to rise. With the US exercising its veto for the fifth time on April 18th this year, the death toll in Gaza stood at some 34,000. Now that nearly 44,000 people has been killed in Gaza, yet the United States still did not hesitate to use its veto. 44,000. It is not some cold statistics. It could be a miner, a nursing mother, or the breadwinner of a family. The loss of each and every one of them means internal pain for the surviving relatives. People cannot help but to ask, do Palestinian lives mean nothing? Can't the deaths of 44,000 people win even a little bit of sympathy from the United States? How many more people have to die before they wake up from their pretend slumber? In the future, when looking back, people will find it hard to understand what happened. The Security Council is mandated under the UN Charter to shoulder the primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security. It is incomprehensible why, for the past years or so, the United States has been so insistent in rendering the Council incapable of playing its role, leading to its paralysis. The US claims to be conducting parallel diplomatic efforts and has repeatedly promised that progress would be made soon in the negotiations. It is incomprehensible then why, to date, the so-called diplomatic negotiations has seen no progress. Why is Israel allowed to continue its military operations while consistently putting forth new conditions for negotiations? In the future, when looking back, people will find it inevitable to feel indignant. Israel has flagrantly breached every red line of international humanitarian law, with its actions causing an unprecedented humanitarian disaster. But even as famine is imminent in Gaza, the United States always seems to be able to find a justification to defend Israel. This represents a distortion and selective disregard of the applicable IHL. People keep learning something new they never knew before was possible, and how low one can stoop. No wonder people feel angry. People's indignation also stems from the fact that the continued supply of weapons from the US has become a decisive factor in the war lasting so long, causing so many casualties and so much destruction. President, The U.S. representative earlier called for the release of hostages in the statement. Our position has been very clear from the beginning. All hostages must be released. An immediate and unconditional ceasefire must be established. Both are important factors. There should be no any conditionality. They cannot be linked to each other. Because facts have shown that Israel's military operations in Gaza have long exceeded the scope of rescuing hostages. Insistence on setting a precondition for ceasefire is tantamount to giving the green light to continuing the war and condoning the continued killing. The repeated use of veto by the United States has reduced the authority of the Security Council and international law to an all-time low, but it is never too late to recognize mistakes made and take corrective actions. We call on the U.S. to take its responsibilities as a permanent member of the Council seriously. The U.S. should stop being passive and evasive, stop dragging its feet deliberately. The U.S. should adopt an attitude accountable to history and support the Council in taking all necessary actions to achieve a ceasefire, save lives, and restore peace. And I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, Slovenia voted in favor of the draft resolution focusing on the demand for an immediate, unconditional and permanent ceasefire. We thank Guyana for the able steering of E10 efforts as the coordinator and the other E10 members for the excellent cooperation in presenting this resolution. Since the start of the war in Gaza more than a year ago, Slovenia has been continuously calling for a strong, united voice from the Council on this issue. We have been supportive of every effort to find that unified response. It is undisputable that this Council is a primary body entrusted with the maintenance of international peace and security. It is the responsibility of every member state to contribute. As an elected member, our sense of responsibility has been growing. The war has brought pain and destruction, confrontations and shockwaves, limitation and attacks on the UN, and violations of international law. From the terrorist attack of Hamas on October 7th, the relentless attacks on civilians and limitation of humanitarian assistance in Gaza, including the siege of northern Gaza and unprecedented obstructions of UNRWA operations, this war represents everything the UN Charter stands against. We regret the veto has been cast. Even more, since this war was its humanitarian impact and spillover effect amounts to a serious threat to international peace and security. We deeply appreciate the work done by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States aimed at reaching a ceasefire deal on the ground. As we clearly stated during the adoption of the Resolution 2735, we believe that calls by the international community, efforts by mediators, and those of a bilateral nature are intertwined and should be mutually reinforcing. Madam President, the suffering in Gaza must end. The suffering of people in Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, and in wider region must end. There must be an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire. Hostages must be released. Humanitarian aid must be scaled up. We have heard countless briefings making it crystal clear. We must act now. It is this Council's responsibility to react to threats to international peace and security. There is an entire generation of children in Gaza that we are failing. They lost their families, their communities, schools, friends, their childhood. This is a war that the Council can and must stop with a united and unequivocal demand for a ceasefire. This is the first step towards achieving a comprehensive solution to the conflict, a first step to give those children a future. Slovenia will support further steps to peace, including an international peace conference and a commitment to global alliance for the implementation of the two-state solution, so that the future generations in Israel and Palestine can live side by side in peace, security, and prosperity. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madam President, France would like to thank the elected members of the Security Council for having prepared this draft resolution, and we deeply regret that it wasn't able to be adopted today. The humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip is disastrous, and it continues to worsen day by day. International humanitarian law is being trampled underfoot. Under these conditions, the only response would have been and remains an immediate and permanent ceasefire. The delivery of aid must meet the needs, particularly in the north of the enclave, which is threatened by famine. All of the hostages must be released without delay and unconditionally. This resolution specifically required this very firmly. France still has 2 hostages in Gaza, and we deeply regret that the Security Council was not able to formulate this demand. We will continue to condemn the terrorist attacks of the 7th of October 2023. The Council must do likewise. And on the basis of agreed parameters, we must work to the implementation of a 2-state solution. There must be security guarantees for the Israelis, and we must work towards the creation of an independent, viable and contiguous Palestinian state. France will continue to work towards these ends. Thank you very much.
The representative of France for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Madam President,
Me disculpo, señora.
Do forgive me, Madam President. I would like to explain that Ecuador voted in favor of the draft resolution that we have just considered, and we are a co-drafter of this together with the other elected members because we share the feeling of urgency for the Council to act once again to put an end to war, to ensure the release of the hostages held by Hamas, and to attend to the disastrous humanitarian situation facing the civilian population in Gaza, approaching famine. For the second time this year, the E10 accepted the challenge of drafting a text that would be acceptable to all members of the Council, and that would allow it to fulfill its responsibility in the face of a pressing situation. The draft resolution is the outcome of a long process of negotiations in which we saw the participation of all members of the Council, and that was coordinated in a very swift and delicate manner by the delegation of Guyana, and we thank you for that. The text that we considered was asking the Council to require an immediate ceasefire, the release of hostages, and the urgent delivery of humanitarian assistance for the civilian population. These demands are shared by an overwhelming majority of the members of this organization. Other elements of great urgency and importance were also included in the draft resolution, such as the need to implement the current resolutions that were adopted in previous months and to meet the standards of international humanitarian law. The text also contains a condemnation of all terrorist acts, which implicitly includes those that have been committed by Hamas on the 7th of October 2023 and the taking of hostages. My delegation once again deplores these barbaric acts, the immediate cause of the war that has now laid waste to Gaza. In such a complex situation, a perfect situation in everyone's eyes is impossible to attain. Ecuador, for example, would have preferred to adopt a resolution that would also contain an explicit condemnation of the terrorist attacks of the 7th of October. However, the 14 votes in favor are a clear indication that the draft resolution that was put for consideration of the Council is timely and appropriate, and it's regrettable that it has not been adopted due to the negative vote of a permanent member of the Council. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. We thank Guyana, the coordinator of the E10 on the resolution on the situation in Gaza, for their commendable and tireless efforts in facilitating the negotiations. We thank all Council members for their engagement and flexibility in the negotiations. Sierra Leone voted in favor of the E10 resolution on the situation in Gaza in order to have a ceasefire and, more importantly, to save lives. We therefore deeply regret that the resolution was not adopted, even though 40 members of the Council, an overwhelming majority, voted for its adoption. 13 months into the conflict in the Gaza Strip, with over 43,500 deaths, hundreds of thousands injured, and about 1.7 million internally displaced persons, with women, children, and young people bearing the brunt of the conflict, it is long overdue for the Security Council, as guided by the Charter of the United Nations, to take an appropriate step to end the carnage in the Gaza Strip. While we recognize the tireless efforts displayed by this Council in adopting 4 resolutions so far, namely 2712, 2720, 2728, and 2735, it is regrettable that the parties to the conflict have failed to fully comply with their respective provisions. The adoption of Resolution 2735 on 10th June 2024 had ushered in renewed optimism that through diplomatic efforts, a deal could be agreed upon that will achieve a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, ensure the release of hostages, guarantee the effective distribution of humanitarian assistance at scale throughout the Gaza Strip, and establish the framework for the reconstruction of Gaza and commence the process for the actualization of the two-state solution. Unfortunately, this process has been slow without any tangible progress, and every day that elapses, we witness more deaths and suffering. For this reason, and the many horrific humanitarian and security reports and briefings on the situation in the Gaza Strip, Sierra Leone joined the E10 initiative to have a text that clearly demands for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire and the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. The text further called for compliance with obligations under international law, access by the civilian population in the Gaza Strip to basic services and humanitarian assistance indispensable for their survival, while acknowledging UNRWA's role in facilitating and distributing aid to civilians. An adoption of this text could have compelled the parties to the conflict to fulfill their legal, political, moral, and humanitarian obligations to the civilians in the Gaza Strip and the hostages held by Hamas since the 7th October 2023. It could have been a path to justice and an enforcement of accountability. It would have allowed this Council the opportunity to affirm its role and unite its strength to save humanity from destruction. Nevertheless, we will not despair, and so Sierra Leone remains committed to supporting any credible and serious political and diplomatic efforts that will finally address this protracted conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, we thank Guyana and other elected members of the Council for the courage they've shown and for their efforts to move today's draft resolution forward. We supported the document, and we pay tribute to those responsible members of the Council who, just like us, understand that there's a need to have the speediest and unconditional ceasefire in Gaza as a gauge for general stabilization in the region. And now I would like my colleagues to listen very carefully to the following part of my statement. Once I finish, I'll explain why. It is shocking that the U.S. has vetoed an effort to save the lives of Palestinians and Israelis, though perhaps we shouldn't be surprised about it. For months, the United States has obstructed and obfuscated, standing in the way of the Council action to address the catastrophic situation in Gaza and playing on one side of the conflict to advance its own political objectives at the expense of Palestinian lives. Today, the Council would have come together to call for a comprehensive ceasefire, protection of civilians, and solution to the whole complex of humanitarian problems faced by the Palestinians. The U.S. claims it is in the interest of the regions, but votes against a resolution supported by the majority of regional countries, and which would have passed for the benefit of the region. We could have demanded today an immediate, unconditional, and sustainable ceasefire in Gaza, as well as an immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. It is unconscionable that the U.S. would cynically stand in the way of demanding such actions to save lives in the world's worst humanitarian crisis. We do not need to be lectured by the United States on hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is what they exhibit every day in different conflicts, not respecting state sovereignty and shamelessly imposing their own rules and interfering in their internal affairs. As a result, tens of thousands of civilian lives have been lost. We are watching the situation closely and will continue to call out abuses and those who are responsible, particularly the United States. We must continue to amplify the voices of Palestinian people who are calling for peace, prosperity, and justice. And the United States cannot stand in the way of that. You gathered, I take it, that what I've just quoted is almost a direct quote from yesterday's statement by the United States during the voting on the resolution on Sudan. And in our view, this was a very appropriate quote. We would like to thank our American colleagues. They relieved us of the need to preparing most of the statement in the explanation of the vote because of their statement yesterday. Now I will address my American colleagues and say that you today have definitively shown that you are fully responsible for the death of tens of thousands of innocent civilians, for the privations of refugees, suffering of hostages, and the illegally detained Palestinians. It was very interesting to hear the representative of the American representative today in the wake of the vote. For example, he said that the resolution does not contain provisions on the release of hostages. Well, it does contain such a provision. Perhaps the U.S. representative should read through the resolution before voting against it. He also stated that the resolution does not have a condemnation of the attack on the 7th of October. I would like to remind our American colleagues here that it was the United States who, on the 18th of October 2023, vetoed a Security Council resolution which condemned a condemnation of the 7th of October attack. The United States positioned themselves as a key partner, not just for Israel, but also for the Arab states. But they vote against resolutions who are in the interest of all of the Arabs and supported by the Arabs themselves. If the draft had been passed, we could have demanded that Israel end its deadly attacks in Gaza, in the West Bank, that it rein in its continued aggression against Lebanon and Syria. We could have sent a very clear signal to the parties to end violence and move on to the political and diplomatic settlement of the Palestinian issue. But the cold and cynical opposition by the United States to the simple demand on behalf of the Council to save human lives is an unconscionable and inhumane act. We have no doubt that the Israelis themselves are interested in ending the spiral of violence, and we categorically reject attempts to present the events on the 7th of October of 2023 as the starting point for the bloody events in the region now. The reasons for that are much deeper, and they have to do with a very old historic injustice where One side was given the opportunity to create their own state, and others have been consistently denied the exact same right. We will continue speaking resolutely for demanding the end of violence against Palestinians. No doubt, we will continue calling out the abuses and hypocrisy by the United States when it comes to settling this situation. We will not allow the United States to muzzle the voice of the Council when and continue emboldening further merciless operations by Israel. Our common duty is to make sure that the voices of the absolute majority of the people on this planet to end this spiral of violence in favor of a just settlement of the Palestinian issue on the basis of an acknowledged basis and the desire to become a full member of the UN, that these voices be heard. We must bring peace, stability, and prosperity to the Middle East. And no one, including the United States and other Western states who indulge them, has a right to inhibit these aspirations. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. Since the adoption of Resolution 2735 this past June, the Security Council has been hoping and expecting the finalization of the deal to achieve an immediate ceasefire and release of all hostages in Gaza. As the president of this council in June, I remember how desperately all council members aspired for the swift implementation of this resolution, which urges both parties, notably Hamas, to accept the proposed agreement. Since then, 5 months have passed, and the conflict has brought even more death, misery, and destruction to Palestinian civilians and Israeli hostages. And it is deeply disappointing that in spite of the efforts by mediators, US, Egypt, and Qatar, Resolution 2735 has yet to be implemented. The Republic of Korea still hopes that those diplomatic efforts will lead to a fruitful outcome that accomplishes an immediate ceasefire along with the release of all hostages. Madam President, as repeatedly pointed out, under this ceaseless armed conflict in Gaza, humanitarian efforts cannot deliver substantive results. An immediate ceasefire is not only an option, it is the only way to save lives in Gaza. This is why the 10 elected members of the Council, including the Republic of Korea, commenced a new initiative demanding an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, and in parallel, demanding an immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. It is regrettable that the draft resolution could not garner the support needed to be adopted today. However, we do believe that all members of the Security Council agree on the imperative of an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, though members may have different views on how to arrive at the goal. Thus, the Republic of Korea will not lose hope for a ceasefire and the release of all hostages at the earliest possible juncture. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, let me express appreciation to Guyana for its important role in pushing forward this important initiative for resolution. It has been more than 400 days since Hamas and others killed more than 1,200 Israelis and took more than 200 hostages, which Japan firmly condemns. Until now, the devastation in Gaza has shown no signs of abating, with tens of thousands of civilian casualties, an appalling death toll of UN personnel and humanitarian aid workers, and massive displacement. Given the ever-worsening situation, this draft resolution, if adopted, would have been a much-needed pronouncement by the Security Council demanding an immediate ceasefire, as well as an immediate release of all hostages. Its passage could also have sent a strong message towards a dramatic expansion of humanitarian aid throughout the Strip, in particular to the most vulnerable Palestinians in the north. Therefore, Japan joined all the other elected members as co-pen holders of this draft resolution and voted in favor. It is deeply regrettable that we could not come to a text which all the Council members can accept. However, now is not that moment to trade accusations for the continuation of this nightmare. The Council member that could not support the draft resolution is working tirelessly to end the agony in Gaza, and Japan continues to support their diplomatic efforts. Madam President, despite today's setback, we should not stop working to improve the catastrophic situation on the ground. Today is World Children's Day, but without our collective actions, the children in Gaza, the future of Gaza, will continue to pay the high price of this conflict. This Council must keep their plight in mind as we work to immediately bring about the long-awaited ceasefire. Japan remains steadfastly committed to this end, both here at this Council and through multilateral and bilateral channels as well. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank all the elected members, in particular our coordinator from Guyana, for their tireless efforts for urgent and necessary action by this Council, and I thank all of the members that supported our resolution. As the co-sponsor, Switzerland voted in favour of this draft resolution and regrets that it was not adopted due to the veto of a permanent member. More than 5 months after the adoption of Resolution 2735, this draft reaffirmed our commitment to an immediate, unconditional and permanent ceasefire, to the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, and to the safe, rapid and unimpeded delivery of humanitarian aid to the civilian population. Switzerland would like to underscore that the obligations of the parties in this matter continue, regardless of whether or not resolutions are adopted by this Council. It is high time that the parties respected these obligations and protected civilians and civilian infrastructure in accordance with international humanitarian law. The violence and dehumanization in this conflict must end. I would like to underline the strong commitment of the group of elected members to unified action by the Council. The Council can continue to count on us for future action to promote peace and security between Israelis and Palestinians and in the region as a whole. Madam President, the situation is urgent. In Gaza, civilians are exposed to hostilities, incessant displacement, epidemics, and the risk of imminent famine, while the hospital system has been almost completely destroyed. As the occupying power, Israel has a duty to ensure that the basic needs of the population in the occupied Palestinian territory are met. This Council must also act in accordance with its mandate to bring about a ceasefire, release all hostages, and protect civilians, including humanitarian personnel, particularly those of the UN. There must be an end to human suffering, a halt to the escalation of violence in the region, and the foundations laid for the solution of 2 democratic states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders. Switzerland will continue to support all efforts in this direction. Thank you.
Thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Madam President. After 5 weeks of intense negotiations and a vote in favour by 14 members of this Council, Guyana deeply regrets that we were unable today to adopt the resolution tabled by the elected member states of this Council to pronounce on the apocalyptic situation in Gaza. The main objective of this draft resolution was to address some of the most critical issues that currently feature in Israel's more than year-long war on Gaza. Those critical issues include the ongoing atrocities of a scale and intensity that caused the death toll to climb on a daily basis and which has now surpassed 43,000. The continued captivity of persons taken from Israel in the brutal attack of 7th of October and the humanitarian situation that appears to have reached its nadir, but then still worsens in unimaginable ways. The resolution just considered responded to these critical issues, building on the legally binding framework that the Council had established through the 4 previous resolutions adopted since 7th of October. Importantly, this resolution would have gone further by adding several critical dimensions to that framework. Those include, for the first time, an unequivocal call for an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza, an affirmation of the centrality of UNRWA's role in the humanitarian response in Gaza, as well as an affirmation that respect for the International Court of Justice and its functions is essential to international law and justice, and to an international order based on the rule of law. Contemplating the end of the war and the mammoth investments that would be required for reconstruction, the resolution sought to make a contribution to day-after planning by requesting the Secretary General to prepare a comprehensive report which would include a needs assessment for Gaza in the short, medium, and long term. It is deeply disappointing, therefore, that these constructive contributions could not be added to the legally binding framework already in place on the war in Gaza. Madam President, many have said that the ongoing annihilation of the Palestinian people is a major stain on our collective human conscience. Today, the Council had the opportunity to begin erasing that stain by demanding an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire. But despite our best efforts and the almost universal support to go in that direction, the Council was again hamstrung by a veto. Guyana hopes that the inability of the Council to adopt this resolution will not be seen by those who want to continue this war as a license to continue killing, starving, and maiming innocent civilians. Madam President, the continuation of sheer misery cannot and must not be the fate of Palestinians. Their suffering must end. They need to see the seeds of peace being planted by this Council. They need to see that this Security Council is giving peace a chance. That hope was dashed today, but it has not been eclipsed. Guyana will continue to work with fellow Council members to try to achieve tomorrow what we could not achieve today. Not trying is simply not an option. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of the United Kingdom. I'd like to start by thanking Guyana and the E10 for their tireless work on this resolution. The United Kingdom voted for this resolution as an expression of our determination to end this war, stop the suffering in Gaza, and secure the immediate release of the hostages. The UK remains resolute in our call for an immediate ceasefire, the immediate release of all hostages cruelly held by Hamas since the 7th of October 2023, and urgent action to address the humanitarian crisis. The deterioration of the humanitarian situation in Gaza is catastrophic and unacceptable. All of Gaza is at the risk of famine, and in some areas, this is likely to be imminent. Yet the aid reaching civilians remains entirely insufficient to mitigate this unfolding disaster. The unthinkable hardship that civilians are already facing in Gaza is set to get even worse as winter approaches. Israel must take urgent action to alleviate this crisis. International humanitarian law must be respected by all sides. We regret that the Council was unable to reach consensus on this issue. But colleagues, we remain committed to the vision of this text, and we will keep striving alongside our partners to bring this war to a close, to secure the release of the hostages, and to secure a huge scale-up in aid and to protect civilians. I resume my function as President of the Council. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. My apologies for taking the floor. I just need to respond very briefly to some comments made by the representative of the Russian Federation. Let me just say, as I've said many times, Russia is in no position to single out any state for being responsible for the deaths and killings of civilians when every day it is raining down hundreds of missiles, bombs, and UAVs on the people of Ukraine, conducting some of the most savage and barbaric attacks seen in Europe since World War II. We will continue to remind the world of this barbarity, carried out by a permanent member of the Security Council in blatant violation of the UN Charter. So, Madam President, I would say to my Russian colleague that he should think twice before accusing anyone of hypocrisy. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Madam President, I'll be brief. I have a rhetorical question to the American representative. You don't have to answer. Do you have any other narrative apart from the one that he has delivered today? When we hear what he's saying, we get the impression that we're watching Groundhog Day, the movie. Groundhog Day. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Observer State of Palestine.
Thank you, Madam President. There is no right to mass killing of civilians. There is no right to starve an entire civilian population. There is no right to forcibly displace a people. And there is no right to annexation. This is what Israel is doing in Gaza. These are its war objectives. This is what the absence of a ceasefire is allowing it to continue doing. This full-fledged Israeli assault against the Palestinian people and the Palestinian land is about everything except the hostages. If the families of hostages can see that, how can anyone in this room claim otherwise? A ceasefire will allow to save lives, all lives. This was true a year ago. This is even more true today. A ceasefire doesn't resolve everything, but it is the first step towards resolving anything. And what is the answer of those who are still unwilling now, after all this death and destruction, not to call for an unconditional ceasefire? Is it to accept that the killing should continue until we resolve everything while we watch that we are resolving nothing? We heard over and over again statements in this chamber by all members without distinction about protection of civilians, about rejecting forcible displacement, about rejecting starving the Palestinian population, about rejecting annexation, about rejecting wanton destruction, about rejecting regional escalation. Everyone around this table agreed on these objectives, and yet here we are. 44,000 Palestinians killed. This is those who are accounted for. Many more are not accounted for. One day we will retrieve them in mass graves under the rubbles, and we will discover the real numbers of this horror. And there will be many that we will never retrieve. Famine, that is looming all over Gaza, that is a reality in northern Gaza. 2 million people displaced, still hunted even when they are in tents. Total destruction of Gaza and all the requirements of life in it. And war on Lebanon, its people and its sovereignty. What does it mean to proclaim all these principles, we reject, we reject, we reject, and then shield Israel of the consequences of its actions, thus allowing it to do exactly what we're asking it to stop doing? Madam President, the world should not grow accustomed to the death of Palestinians, to seeing Palestinian children starving, to seeing mothers carrying their children from one place to another, forcibly displaced. They should not get accustomed to seeing journalists killed and humanitarians killed, to see Palestinians detained, abducted, carried on trucks to go be tortured, sexually abused, and raped. The fact we are Palestinians does not make that less shocking or less outrageous. Maybe for some we have the wrong nationality, the wrong faith, the wrong skin color. But we are humans, and we should be treated as such. Is there a UN charter for Israel that is different from the charter you all have? Tell us. Is there an international law for them, an international law for us? Do they have the right to kill, and the only right we have is to die? What the hell does Israel need to do more for this council to act under Chapter 7? What more can they do for this council to act under Chapter 7? Or will this council be the last place on earth that cannot recognize a threat to peace when they see it? When it is so glaring, so undeniable? You are witnessing the attempt to annihilate a nation, destroy a nation. It is not even hidden, it is in plain sight. And yet the very tools designed to respond to these situations are not being used. So which one is it? Are Palestinian lives not worth saving? Or does Israel have a license to kill? Can this council only adopt resolutions and then witness their blatant breach? This self-inflicted powerlessness has to stop. And like Algeria, we repeat, the resolutions of this council are binding. Their role is to be enforced. Their role is to change reality, not to record violations for history's purposes and then allow them to continue. Had diplomatic efforts succeeded, we would not be here. We recognize all the efforts that were done, all the diplomatic efforts that were conducted. And yet, we have to recognize children are still starving in Gaza. Families are being killed. Communities are being obliterated. Had these efforts succeeded, we would not be here. But what we cannot accept is that Israel has a veto that blocks any attempts to put an end to this war, especially when we know what are its true intentions. Madam President, many peoples, many governments around the world are saying the right things and trying to do the right things. And we have here to express our gratitude to the E10 for their relentless efforts for over a year now, and in the recent month. We all were hoping that 2735 would lead to a ceasefire. And we can discuss who is responsible for that ceasefire not occurring. For us, it is pretty clear that Israel had never an intention to accept a ceasefire and has found every reason not to have a ceasefire. We thank Guyana for its efforts in coordinating the E10 initiative. We thank all of those who have voted in favor of this resolution, and we agree with Malta and with Algeria. This is the bare minimum. This is the bare minimum that morality, humanity, legality would plead for. And this bare minimum, even this bare minimum, was vetoed. I truly do not understand, and you're saying we cannot be for an unconditional ceasefire. What that means in effect now is that we are for a war You're saying we cannot be for an unconditional ceasefire that does not release the hostages. Is this war releasing the hostages? Is it even trying to release the hostages? So what does it mean? We accept this war that is killing hostages and that is killing, maiming, terrorizing, destroying an entire nation. When is it enough? When is it the point where we say, no, we mean ceasefire now, now. We will not allow you to not listen to us, to ignore us, to insult us, to play games with us. This resolution is trying to restore life, to save lives. It's not a dangerous message. The draft resolution is not a dangerous message. This veto is a dangerous message to Israel that it can continue executing its plans, the very plans you oppose. And the messages we send do matter. And that is the wrong message at the worst possible time. Israel is responsible for the Palestinian civilians it kills. It cannot be absolved of that responsibility. It is killing them purposefully, deliberately, repeatedly, massively. It is starving them on purpose. Nobody can deny it. We sat in this room, we heard every UN agency, every testimony, every NGO, Palestinian, Israeli, international, saying the same things. This is by design. What does it mean that release of the hostages should be unconditional? This is what the Council has said repeatedly now for a year. Release of hostages should be unconditional. But stopping killing Palestinians is conditional? There are acceptable conditions to stop the mass killing of Palestinians? There's 100 Israeli hostages, and there's 2 million Palestinians in Gaza. 2 million Palestinians in Gaza. They deserve better. They deserve respect for their lives, for their suffering. Israel will always claim conditions have not been met because its plans require it to continue this war, to annex the land and destroy the people. And therefore, we can no longer accept its conditions. 14 months, and we are still debating if a genocide must be stopped. There's no justification whatsoever for vetoing a resolution trying to stop atrocities. No justification for that. Madam President, one day someone will dig up these meetings, the records of them, will see us pleading for the lives of our people over and over and over and over again. And they will try to understand why our calls were not heeded. They will look at the people who sat around this table and spoke and addressed you from all over the world to call on the Council to take action. They will read what everybody here has said, and then they will wonder how a genocide displayed on TVs known to the whole world was able to continue for this long. They will wonder if the whole world is against the mass killing, against the displacement, against the starvation, against the annexation. How come they all occurred? It is because we are allowed to speak about the rules, but not to enforce them. Because we can regret and reject, but not act. There are many states now stepping up to change this reality. We call on all states and all peoples to stand for life, for freedom, and for peace. We are out of time. We repeat, we are against harming any civilians. And we have more than our share of grievances. We could have sat here and tried to justify harming civilians. We never did, not one day. And we're still sitting here after tens of thousands of our people have been killed. Many have been detained. All have been traumatized. All have been displaced. We have many reasons to say otherwise, and yet we remain steadfast. There is no reason to harm civilians, regardless of their nationality, their origin, regardless of the circumstances. But our civilians, what about our civilians? They are worthy of protection. Their lives should be saved. People cannot sit and demand Palestinian pacifism under all circumstances and enable Israeli militarism. That cannot be done. Either you believe violence is an impasse, you believe there are no military solutions, and then you act for peaceful ones and reject military ones, or you let it be military. We are for a peaceful path. Even after all that has happened, we are for a peaceful path. Help us chart it, not block it. Stop them. Help us. You would be helping Palestinians and Israelis in our region and the world. Madam President, there is a world out there where Palestinian children are able to grow. We are not born to be occupied and killed and displaced. That's not our destiny, that's not our fate. There is a world where we could live and grow and see our children grow with no occupation, no bombs, no tents, no settlements, no walls, no military checkpoints, no prisons, no constant humiliation, no oppression, no house demolished, no amputations, no pain and no agony. That world can exist today if we were to act. And the fact we are not means that many, many more Palestinians will suffer and others will suffer. We are trying to get there. We are trying to find a path that leads us there, to freedom, to life, and to peace. That should be our common objective. There is a world where there's no war in the Middle East, where Palestinians and Israeli civilians go about their lives, where maybe they can look confidently towards the future and even envisage more bridges between them, where our region unleashes its true and full potential for the benefit of all states and all peoples. It's this future that is being destroyed before our very eyes. And the entire Palestinian civilian population is the primary victim. Madam President, we call on the General Assembly to uphold the responsibilities that the Council has failed to uphold, owing to the US veto. We call on all states to use all available tools to stop the massacres. What this resolution was calling for is an unconditional end to massacres, and that is always worth supporting.
I thank the representative of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President. Before I start, I've listened to your speech very carefully, and you mentioned a future with no pain, no suffering, but you haven't mentioned one word during your speech, and I've listened very carefully. What about Hamas? You have to include in your speech a future for Gaza is a future with no Hamas. You cannot describe a world or a reality and not mentioning the reason why we are sitting in this room today, the brutality of Hamas and the pain that the people of Gaza are suffering because of Hamas. Madam President, today most of the members of this Council failed. They betrayed their own principles, their responsibilities to the innocent, and their duty to uphold justice. The resolution brought before this chamber was not a path to peace. It was a roadmap to more terror, more suffering, and more bloodshed. Many of you attempted to pass this injustice. We thank the United States for exercising its veto, for standing on the side of morality and justice, for refusing to abandon the hostages and their families. The text ignored the suffering of the 101 innocent hostages still held by Hamas in Gaza. Had it passed today, this Council would have sent a message to the world that terrorists can act with impunity, that the United Nations will shield and surrender to murderers, rapists, and kidnappers, rather than holding them accountable. Last week, Sasha Trofanov should have celebrated his 29th birthday, surrounded by friends and family. Instead, he is being held by terrorist monsters who recently released a video showcasing his torture. Sasha is starved, his face bruised, his spirit crushed. Hamas doesn't just imprison, they torment, they dehumanize, they rejoice in their cruelty, and now they know that this Council will do nothing to stop them. I would like to remind Ambassador Navzia that Sasha is a Russian citizen. He is included in the 29 nations which have citizens held hostage by Hamas, your citizens. Neama Levy, a bright young woman, just 19 years old, was taken and dragged into hell. Neama volunteered at a kindergarten for refugees, bringing light and love to children in need. You have seen the horrible images. Her ankles cut, her sweatpants soaked in blood. Neama's innocence, her humanity, her dreams, all stolen by Hamas. And today, someone in this council told her family that her life is not worth enough to demand her freedom. Those who supported this resolution have announced to the world Sasha's life, Naama's life, and the lives of 99 other innocent people are not valuable enough to be a condition for a ceasefire. Today, the UN celebrates International Children's Day. Rather than demanding that little children like Ariel and Kfir Bivas will be released immediately after 411 days in captivity, this council is attempting to pass a resolution which declares that their precious lives are not worth your time. This is not diplomacy. It is appeasement. It is abandonment of the very ideal that this council claims to defend. The world should be clear-eyed about what this text truly represents. It rewards Hamas for their barbarity. It validates their strategy of using human shields, targeting civilians, and tormenting hostages in their terror dungeons. It would have set a horrifying precedent that terrorism pays, that violence is met not with condemnation, but with concessions. Why you couldn't agree about condemnation of Hamas? You mentioned you worked tirelessly about drafting this resolution. Couldn't you sit down, the 14 countries who voted for that, and agree about a condemnation in this resolution? Like one line? We condemn the atrocities of Hamas? Was it so difficult? This council has already adopted 4 resolutions demanding the release of the hostages. Hamas has ignored every one of them. Why wouldn't they? They have faced no consequences for their crimes, no repercussions for their atrocities, no accountability for their barbarity. Madam President, the loss of civilian life in Gaza is a tragedy. But it is a tragedy authored by Hamas. They started this war. You have to say it. You have to say that they started on October 7th. We are not here because we wanted to be here. They have held innocent Israelis hostage for over 400 days with no sign of life or humanitarian access. They use Palestinian civilians as human shields. If this council fails to place the blame on the terrorists, it only emboldens them further. Israel will continue to defend itself. We will never abandon our hostages. And you have to understand that. Look at your values and understand why. We will never forget them, and we will never stop fighting for their freedom. If Hamas were to release the hostages and surrender their weapons, not one more shot would need to be fired. But until that day comes, Israel will do whatever it takes to protect its people and bring our loved ones home. Today, this council had the opportunity to stand on the side of justice, decency, and humanity. If not for the United States, it would have chosen appeasement, to reward terror and abandon the innocent. History will remember this vote. It will remember who stood with the hostages, the victims, and the principles of peace, and who betrayed them to shield terrorists. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Israel for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
It's balanced?
The third one should be here.
Okay. Good morning, members of the media. I'm honored to make this statement on behalf of the 10 elected members of the Security Council, namely Algeria, Ecuador, Japan, Malta, Mozambique, Republic of Korea, Sierra Leone, Slovenia, Switzerland, and my own country, Guyana. Today, a resolution drafted by the E10 member states was tabled for adoption by the Security Council to address the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. The resolution was developed over a 5-week period, during which the E10 demonstrated great flexibility to reach consensus in the Council. At the time that the decision was taken to develop this draft, 4 months had elapsed since the passage of Resolution 2735. We had all supported 2735 with the expectation that a ceasefire deal would have been agreed and implemented swiftly. Therefore, in the context of a rapidly increasing death toll and widespread injury, destruction, and forced displacement in the Gaza Strip, we, the E10, concluded that any new resolution by the Council should go further than the last 4 resolutions in relation to the conflict in Gaza. Importantly, our delegations acknowledged the significance of unequivocally demanding an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire, while also reiterating the demand for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. We are therefore deeply disappointed that the text was not adopted. Notwithstanding the non-adoption of the draft resolution that we put forward, the E10 is using this platform today to underscore 3 key messages. First, the war in Gaza must end immediately, unconditionally, and permanently, and all remaining hostages must be immediately and unconditionally released. Second, there must be full, rapid, safe, and unhindered entry of humanitarian assistance at scale to and throughout the Gaza Strip, so that Palestinian civilians can secure the relief they urgently need. In this regard, we also stress that UNRWA is the backbone of the humanitarian response in Gaza, and we call on all parties to enable the agency to carry out its vital mandate. Third, the parties must abide by their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law, particularly with regard to the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure, the treatment of detainees, and the delivery of humanitarian aid. Our collective efforts to end the hostilities will not stop. Once more, the E10 is underscoring to the international community, and more importantly, to the hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians who continue to bear the cost of these hostilities, as well as those still held hostage and their loved ones, that we are deeply conscious that the Security Council bears the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace. We are deeply committed to this responsibility and will continue our best efforts to try to facilitate Council unity on this critical matter. Too many lives have already been lost. I thank you.
Ambassador, Xu Deji with China Central Television. Now it's the 5th time that U.S. vetoed the draft resolution calling for ceasefire. What now? What are we going to have in the Security Council? What is the way out? Thank you.
We will continue our efforts. Thank you.
Do you think Israel is committing genocide in Gaza?
You can decide.